It always starts the same way, not with battle, not with blood, but with silence. The kind of silence that only exists before something dies. You can hear your heart in it, steady but heavy, like the rhythm of a distant war drum. Somewhere far away the artillery breathes, the ground shivers. Dust falls like ash. You tell yourself it's just another day in the Emperor's army. Another mission, another kill, another number in a ledger that no one reads. But deep down you already know the truth. This isn't about survival anymore. It's about what's left of you when the killing stops. His name was Khorne Hale, 47th Regiment, Astra Militarum, one of the countless men born to fight, bleed and die in a war so vast it no longer needed reasons. His world was like so many others, a gray industrial husk stripped of oceans, forests, and meaning. The Manufactoria never slept. Its skies were an endless bruise of smoke. From the moment he could walk, Khorne knew the shape of a lasgun stock better than his mother's face. He didn't hate the Imperium. He simply didn't have the imagination to question it. Until the day the sky fell. It began with a sound, a low rolling vibration that moved through the trenches like a living thing. The orcs had come again, screaming through the void on ships stitched from rust and madness. The air itself turned to metal as the first shells landed. Khorne was thrown into the mud, ears ringing, lungs full of dust. When he lifted his head, he saw what would change him forever. A boy from his unit, no older than 16, crawling with half his body gone, still reaching for his weapon. He tried to help him. He really did. But then another shell hit, and another, and by the time the dust cleared, there was nothing left to help. That was the first time Khorne felt it. Not rage, not grief, but something simpler. Stillness. The world had stopped moving, and for a single terrible second, everything made sense. There was no fear, no doubt, no orders, just instinct. He pulled the trigger until the barrel glowed red, and in that rhythm, that clean mechanical rhythm, he found peace. It would take years before he understood what that feeling was. The first spark. The beginning of the end. After that day, Khorne changed. Slowly at first. He stopped praying before missions. He stopped caring about promotions, about food, about the endless sermons blaring from the Vox. All that mattered was the fight. The heat of the lasgun, the recoil in his shoulder, the brief wait of a trigger before release. He became efficient, detached, mechanical. His commanders called it discipline. His squad called it madness. But Khorne called it clarity. War, he realized, was the only thing that ever told the truth. The Emperor's priests could preach about loyalty, about sacrifice, but they never felt the pulse of it. That moment when a man's life ended under your hand and something inside you whispered yes. Not joy, not satisfaction, just permission. That permission was what Khorne fed on. But Khorne didn't know that yet. Not then. The war stretched on for years. Front lines shifted, planets burned, names were forgotten. Khorne stopped counting kills. He stopped remembering faces. He became a machine of flesh, a servitor without wires, powered by muscle and hate. But hate without direction is hunger. And hunger always finds a god. It happened during the siege of Vathros Prime. The regiment had been fighting for 72 days without reinforcement. The enemy, twisted cultists of the ruinous powers, fought with a kind of joy that unsettled even the veterans. They sang as they died. They laughed as they burned. Khorne's unit was trapped in a manufactorum complex, the walls shaking with every bombardment. They'd run out of food 3 days ago, out of ammunition yesterday. The priests kept chanting that the Emperor would provide. But the Emperor was quiet, and silence, Khorne knew, was dangerous. Then came the assault. It wasn't a battle. It was slaughter. Hundreds of cultists poured through the broken gates, naked and screaming, armed with blades carved from their own bones. The air stank of copper and incense. Khorne fought until his last pack went dry, then until his knife broke, and then with his bare hands. He doesn't remember how many he killed, only that his vision tunneled, that time stretched, that something inside him opened. When it was over, the floor was slick with blood. The last cultist fell with a smile on his face, whispering something in a language Khorne didn't understand. And then, for the first time, Khorne looked down at his reflection in the puddle beneath his boots. The water wasn't clear. It was red, and in the red, his reflection smiled back. He blinked, and it was gone. But that night, as he tried to sleep, he heard it, faintly, beneath the hum of the dying reactor. A heartbeat. Not his own. Deep, distant, patient. It didn't speak in words. It didn't need to. The message was simple. You fought well. From that moment, something in him shifted. He began to see patterns in chaos. Shapes in the blood spray, whispers in the static, meaning in the madness. Every kill felt right, as if he were being graded by an invisible hand. He told no one, of course. Who would he tell? The commissars would execute him for less. But he started marking the kills. Not tally marks, symbols, circles within circles, spirals shaped like veins. It wasn't ritual, not yet. It was memory. Weeks later, during the final push, Khorne's unit was ordered to retake a plasma refinery. The enemy had fortified it with heavy guns and sorcery alike. Everyone knew it was suicide. But suicide had become routine. They charged at dawn. The refinery was hell incarnate. Molten metal spilling from ruptured pipes, corpses welded into walls by heat. Khorne's ears bled from the noise. He didn't care. He pushed through, covered in soot and gore, killing until he forgot what his hands were for. When he finally reached the central chamber, he found the cult leader waiting for him. The man wore no armor, only chains. His eyes burned like furnace coals. "You've already chosen," he said. Khorne didn't answer. He simply drove his bayonet through the man's throat. But as the cultist fell, he smiled, the same smile as the others, and with his dying breath, he whispered, "Then serve." The explosion that followed leveled the refinery. Khorne was the only survivor. When they found him 3 days later, buried under ash and bone, his armor had melted into his flesh. His eyes were red from burst vessels, and carved into his chest, in letters made by his own fingernails, were 4 words: "Blood for the blood god." He didn't remember doing it. He didn't remember anything. But he remembered the feeling, the stillness, the peace. When the medic tried to treat him, he snapped the restraints and tore out one of their throats with his teeth. The guards shot him 7 times before he stopped moving. They left his body to burn, but Khorne doesn't let his servants rest. That night, as the ashes cooled, something stirred. The blood that had pooled around Khorne began to boil. His corpse twitched once, twice, and then rose. Skin blistered, bones cracking, eyes alight with fury, and something worse. Purpose. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The battlefield had become his cathedral, and the corpses his choir. He walked into the darkness barefoot, the ground hissing under every step. And from that moment on, wherever he went, war followed. The Imperium recorded the event as a demonic resurgence. The Inquisition called it possession, but those who saw it, those who felt the air burn and the ground bleed, called it what it was: ascension. The spark beneath the skin had become a fire. And in the quiet after the screams, you could still hear the heartbeat, slow, steady, patient, waiting for the next name, the next sacrifice, the next soldier to break beneath the weight of his own fury, because Khorne never creates monsters. There's a moment when rage stops being a choice and becomes a rhythm. The first time you kill, it feels like thunder. Sharp, terrifying, electrifying. The second time, it feels easier. By the 10th, you don't feel anything at all. The body moves. The blood falls. The air hums with violence, and in that hum, something ancient starts to take root. That's when Khorne truly begins to work. Not through temptation, not through whispers, but through repetition. Khorne Hale was no longer a soldier. The Imperium listed him as missing in action, his name forgotten, his rank erased. But names never mattered to Khorne. What mattered was rhythm, the steady pattern of breath, pulse, strike, silence. And Khorne had mastered that rhythm. He became a ghost on the war fronts, moving from one dying world to another, drawn by the scent of blood and the promise of more. The Astra Militarum called him a deserter. The Inquisition called him cursed. But the men who fought beside him called him something else, the Butcher of Vathros. They said he killed without speaking, that his lasgun never jammed, that he walked through storms of shrapnel untouched. Some said they saw a red light flicker behind his eyes, like embers waiting for breath. They weren't wrong. The truth was simpler. Khorne had stopped trying to survive. He had started to feed. Every kill was fuel, not for his body, but for something burning behind it. He stopped wearing Imperial insignia. He stopped sleeping. When he ran out of ammunition, he fought with his hands, his teeth, the bones of his enemies. He fought because it was all that made sense anymore. Each kill was clean, efficient, ritualistic. That's how hate becomes habit, one cut at a time. By the time Imperial recon drones found him again, he was knee-deep in corpses, surrounded by a halo of smoke and flame. They ordered him to stand down. He didn't even turn his head. The report says he tore apart an entire platoon with nothing but a broken chain blade. That's when they realized the truth. He wasn't fighting them. He was fighting for something. They called in the Inquisition, Inquisitor Alaric Dorn arrived on the world of Kalor to investigate what the local garrisons described as an ongoing massacre of indeterminate allegiance. His landing craft touched down amidst burning ruins, thousands dead, some cut to pieces, others crushed into the mud. It looked like the work of demons, but there was order in the chaos. The bodies were stacked deliberately, forming the symbol of a circle broken by a blade. "Not chaos," Dorn whispered, his breath fogging his rebreather. Devotion. He didn't know it then, but that was Khorne's art. Not randomness, not madness, but design. The Inquisitor's team found Khorne 3 days later, sitting in the center of the carnage, covered in blood that wasn't his. He was sharpening a jagged piece of metal, humming softly to himself. Dorn described the sound as low, rhythmic, mechanical. When they tried to detain him, he looked up and smiled. "Do you hear it?" Khorne asked. "Hear what?" Dorn demanded. "The pulse," Khorne said. "It never stops." The Inquisitor ordered him shot. 7 bolt rounds tore through Khorne's chest. He fell without a sound. But when Dorn's team approached the body, they saw the impossible. The wounds were still bleeding, but the blood wasn't spilling out. It was rising. It coiled like smoke, wrapping around Khorne's arms, his chest, his face. His eyes snapped open, glowing with molten red light. And then the screaming began. The Vox recordings recovered later were almost inaudible. Static, gurgling, bursts of human shrieks interlaced with something like growling metal. When silence returned, Dorn's team was gone. All that remained were bones, clean, dry, arranged neatly in a circle, and Khorne Hale was walking again. From that day forward, no one saw him as human. To the ecclesiarchy, he was proof of corruption, a man consumed by his own bloodlust. To Khorne, he was a disciple. To himself, he was nothing at all. Because that's what happens when hate becomes habit. It strips away the person until all that's left is function. You stop asking why you fight. You just fight. Every battle after that blurred together. He became a storm of flesh and steel, moving through worlds like a virus. On Vardros IV, he led an uprising against a planetary governor, killing tens of thousands before setting fire to the Hive's main cathedral. On Delveris Reach, he single-handedly destroyed a squadron of Adeptus Arbites with a single chain axe. Each act drew attention, not from men, but from the warp. Something began to follow him. It started small. Shadows moving where none should, whispers echoing across comms, machinery that trembled when he passed. The air around him shimmered like heat haze. When blood was spilled, it never dried. It hung in the air like incense, burning in shapes no one could understand. Witnesses claimed they heard a sound behind him as he fought. The faint clang of chains, the beat of drums from nowhere, the guttural chant of unseen voices. The more he killed, the louder it became. And then came the night he stopped pretending. The battle was on the desert moon of Tarsus V, a forgotten outpost stripped of life by centuries of mining. The Imperium wanted it for Promethium. The heretics wanted it for relics buried beneath the sand. Khorne wanted it for the noise. The air was thick with dust and static. The twin suns hung low, bleeding into the horizon. When the fighting began, it was pure madness. Blades clashing, lasguns hissing, men screaming. But Khorne didn't hear any of it. He heard drums. Each strike matched their rhythm. Each kill deepened their tone. And when the blood finally reached his knees, he felt it. A presence pressing against his mind like a furnace door cracking. "Open!" He looked up at the sky and saw it burning. Red. That's when he spoke the words for the first time. Blood for the blood. God. The soldiers nearest him froze. Some dropped their weapons. Others tried to flee. But it was too late. The ground split beneath their feet, and something crawled out. A shadow made of heat and muscle, shaped like a man but far too large. Its skin slick with blood. Its jaw lined with tusks of bone. It looked at Khorne and smiled. The demon spoke without sound. Its voice was the drumbeat itself. "You've earned my gaze." That's all it said before it vanished. The blood fell silent. The battlefield went still. When the survivors later returned, they found the entire valley turned black, as if scorched by fire. In the center was Khorne, kneeling in the sand, carving something into his arm with a blade made of bone. A mark. It wasn't a sigil he had seen before, but he didn't need to. He understood what it meant. He wasn't just killing anymore. He was serving. That night, under a blood-red sky, Khorne whispered his first prayer. It was short, wordless, almost childlike, but Khorne heard it, and that was enough. From that moment forward, his rage was no longer human. His heart no longer beat on its own. It moved with the rhythm of a god who didn't need to speak to be obeyed. Khorne Hale, soldier, sinner, ghost, ceased to exist. What remained was purpose, and the universe would bleed for it. They say corruption starts with a whisper, but that isn't true. The beginning of damnation is quieter than that. It's the moment you look into your reflection and realize it's looking back. For Khorne Hale, that moment came not in battle, but in the aftermath. The fighting on Tarsus Fiv had ended weeks ago, though no one remembered how. The Imperium declared the planet uninhabitable, purged it from records, and ordered orbital bombardment. But buried under dunes of blackened glass, Khorne was still alive. He had no memory of how he survived. Only flashes, fire, screams, the demon's smile, the mark carved into his arm that still pulsed faintly beneath his skin like a second heartbeat. He had felt pain before, wounds, burns, broken bones, but this was different. The mark wasn't a scar. It was alive. When he moved, it glowed faintly. When he slept, it throbbed with rhythm, a slow, methodical pulse, like the measured beat of a war drum heard through a dream. He wandered for days across the wastes, feeding on melted snow and the flesh of carrion beasts. The air stank of ash and blood. The sky had turned the color of dying embers. And in every shadow he thought he saw movement. Shapes forming faces, faces forming his own. At first, he thought it was madness, isolation, guilt, the kind of hallucination that soldiers get after too many years of war. But one night, under a broken moon, he found a shard of glass half buried in the sand, a fragment from a melted habdome. He picked it up, intending to use it as a knife. That's when he saw it. His reflection. At first, it was just his face, gaunt, scarred, eyes hollow from hunger. But as he stared, the reflection began to smile. His real mouth didn't move, but the one in the glass did. Slowly, deliberately, like something waking from a long sleep. He dropped the shard. It didn't matter. The image lingered in his mind. For the rest of that night, he could feel it watching him from behind his eyes. Not haunting, inhabiting. There's a point when possession and acceptance become the same thing. The mark on his arm started spreading, thin veins of dark red crawling up his neck and across his chest. It didn't hurt. It thrummed as if it were listening to something he couldn't hear. And in that sound, that subsonic hum, he began to make out words, not spoken, but felt. There is no sin in strength. There is no guilt in blood. Only those who hesitate die unfulfilled. He didn't question where the voice came from. He didn't want to. For the first time in his life, Khorne felt calm. Not the calm of peace, the calm of clarity. He had spent years believing he was fighting for survival, for the Imperium, for the Emperor. But now, as the dunes hissed with falling ash and his veins burned like molten iron, he understood the truth. He had been fighting for this. The mark was not punishment. It was purpose. When he finally emerged from the wastes, he wasn't alone anymore. Rumors spread across nearby systems of a red-clad figure walking through battlefields long after the fighting ended. Scavengers who followed the smell of blood, only to find a single man sitting amidst the corpses, silent and still, surrounded by flies that refused to land on him. Some said he was a saint of the Emperor, come to bless the dead. Others swore he was a demon of vengeance, a spirit feeding on war. The truth was far simpler. He was both. When Khorne found the next war, it didn't matter whose side he was on. Guardsmen, heretics, mercenaries, it was all the same. The moment the fighting began, he was reborn. His body moved like an instrument playing a song only he could hear. Each swing, each kill, was perfect, clean, precise. The mark on his skin glowed brighter with every death, feeding off the heat of the carnage. And then came the mirror again. This time, it wasn't glass. It was steel, the side of a tank, dented and half-melted from plasma fire. He caught his reflection in it as he walked past, soaked in blood. And once again, the reflection smiled, but this time it spoke. Not aloud, not in words, but the meaning was clear. You've become beautiful. Khorne felt his heart stop for a moment. His hands trembled. The face staring back wasn't his anymore. Or rather it was, but sharpened, angled, predatory. The eyes burned red not from rage, but from awareness. He touched his cheek, and the reflection did the same. But its hand was armored. A gauntlet of living metal veined with veins that pulsed like arteries. When he blinked, the image was gone. But the feeling stayed. It wasn't hallucination. It was revelation. That was the day Khorne stopped pretending he was still human. He began to paint his armor red, not for allegiance, but remembrance. Every world he walked bled into it. Every kill deepened its hue. The red wasn't just color, it was history. He carved runes into the plating, not the symbols of chaos, but the tally marks of his own becoming. Each one meant something different, a life taken, a lesson learned, a piece of humanity surrendered willingly. That's the secret of Khorne's corruption. It never forces you. It makes you want it. It dresses devotion as instinct and calls obedience choice. By the time the World Eaters found him, Khorne didn't even resist. They came like storms, drop pods slamming into the battlefield like falling meteors, ceramite giants tearing through lines of soldiers like beasts through tall grass. To the mortals, they were monsters. To Khorne, they were kin. One of them, a massive warrior clad in blood-crusted armor, stopped before him. The bronze trim of his pauldrons gleamed like old fire. The 8-pointed star burned faintly across his breastplate. "You carry his mark," the warrior said through a vox grill that growled like thunder. "I earned it," Khorne replied. The giant nodded. "Then you are ours." Khorne didn't kneel. He didn't speak. He simply raised his weapon, an axe, crudely forged from scavenged steel, and pressed it to his palm. Blood spilled down the blade. The warrior laughed, a sound like distant thunder. "Welcome to the Red Path," he said. From that day forward, Khorne marched with the World Eaters, not as a slave, not as a recruit, but as an equal. In their eyes, he was proof that the line between mortal and demon was not crossed. It was worn away. And yet, even among them, Khorne was different. The mark on his flesh never stopped spreading. It branched across his body like roots, crawling beneath his skin in patterns too deliberate to be natural. When he fought, the others heard things, faint whispers between heartbeats, the sound of 1,000 drums echoing from nowhere. When he slept, his breath came out in puffs of steam that smelled faintly of iron. He no longer dreamed of battle. He dreamed of mirrors. In them he saw worlds burning, oceans of blood boiling under skies of brass. He saw a throne made of skulls, endless and eternal, and at its base, himself, kneeling, smiling, waiting. Every morning, he woke drenched in sweat, his reflection watching from the blade of his axe. And each day, the reflection looked less like a man and more like a god's memory of one. That's the final cruelty of Khorne's gift. You don't become something else. You become the truest version of what you already are. Khorne didn't lose himself. He found himself. The mark had stopped burning. It now beat with his pulse, a rhythm that matched the drums of the blood god himself. And when he finally stood before the next battlefield, surrounded by roaring World Eaters and the stench of burning flesh, he looked to the sky and smiled, because the reflection wasn't in the mirror anymore. It was in him, and Khorne, silent, watching, patient, smiled back. They say Khorne has no temples, only battlefields. No hymns, only screams. No priests, only killers. But those who've seen what happens when his favor deepens know better. There are temples. They're built from bone. There is music. It's played on the screams of the dying. And every follower who kills long enough, true enough, eventually hears it, the choir of skulls. For Khorne Hale, that revelation came not through a vision, but through noise. Endless, unbearable noise. The campaign on Thessalon had lasted for months. The planet was once a forge world, now reduced to black cinders and choking dust. Titans lay in ruin, their reactors leaking fire into the horizon. The sky bled constantly from orbital bombardment, and the air was a choir of engines, screaming metal, and distant thunder. To most, it was hell. To Khorne, it was home. The World Eaters called it the Proving, a test. Those who lived through it would earn the right to follow the Red Crusade across the stars. Those who didn't, their skulls would serve a different purpose. Khorne had long stopped counting the dead. There was no point. Each skull was a prayer, each death an offering. His weapon, once a scavenged blade, now reforged from the bones of a fallen champion, had become part of him. When it struck, it sang. When it cut, it whispered. And when it rested, it pulsed softly with warmth, as if content. The first time he heard the choir was after 3 days of fighting without pause. The World Eaters had overrun a Mechanicus citadel, its defenders still chanting litanies to the Omnissiah as they were torn apart. Khorne led the charge into the lower foundries, where the last tech priests had barricaded themselves. The air was heavy with steam and blood. The walls shook with the rhythm of industry and war. But beneath that, faintly, almost imperceptibly, there was harmony. At first, Khorne thought it was machinery, the whine of cooling fans, the thrum of generators. But it wasn't mechanical. It was organic. Dozens, maybe hundreds of voices chanting in unison, their tones rising and falling like waves of molten brass. He followed the sound deeper into the complex. Every step echoed in perfect rhythm with the chant. When he reached the core chamber, he understood. The choir wasn't singing to Khorne. It was Khorne. The floor was a mosaic of skulls, not carved but fused. Thousands of human and xenocraniums melted together into a single surface. Blood seeped between their teeth and pooled around his boots. Their mouths were open, and from those hollow mouths came the sound, the hymn that had haunted his dreams. Each voice was distinct, yet they formed a perfect whole, a symphony of rage and devotion, a song of endings, and at its center stood a throne. Not grand, not gilded. A crude pile of bone and iron, rising out of the blood like a tumor. Upon it sat no god, no demon, only a shadow flickering in and out of sight. It had no face, no body, only presence. And when it spoke, it didn't speak in words. It spoke in memory. Khorne saw flashes. The boy he once was, the first kill, the desert wastes, the reflections smile. Every moment of his life condensed into a single heartbeat, and through it all ran a single truth. He had never been alone. Every act of violence had been heard. He fell to his knees, not in submission, but recognition. This was what he had been killing toward. This was what all the blood meant. Not chaos. Not madness, order, the order of violence. The mathematics of slaughter. The shadow before him pulsed once, and then vanished. But the song remained. When Khorne rose, the other World Eaters were watching. None spoke. None needed to. They could feel it too, the shift, the stillness that followed revelation. From that moment on, wherever Khorne went, the battlefield followed. Some swore they heard the chant when he fought. Distant, ghostly, echoing in the roar of chain blades and bolter fire. Others claimed that the dead around him never rotted, that their skulls turned toward him as if listening. The Inquisition would later call it warp resonance. The cults called it the blessing. But among the World Eaters they called him something else, Skullbearer. He carried the song wherever he went. He no longer spoke in battle. He no longer shouted his war cries. He didn't need to. The choir spoke for him. Every world they raised added to it. Every massacre deepened its tone. Soon, even the veterans began to avoid fighting too close to him. Not out of fear, but reverence. They said the air around him shimmered with red heat, that those who stood beside him could feel their blood boil with purpose. Khorne was no longer following Khorne's path. He was the path, and yet there was something deeper still, something calling from beyond the blood. One night, after a campaign that turned the entire moon of Krether into slag, Khorne stood alone on the battlefield. The stars burned red. The planet's surface cracked beneath his boots. All around him the skulls of the dead steamed in the cooling air. Then, as the silence settled, the choir began again. But this time, it wasn't external. It wasn't from the world, it came from within. He felt his heartbeat align with it. His veins pulsed in time. His breath matched the rhythm. He was no longer hearing the choir, he was becoming it. He dropped his axe and fell to his knees, clutching his head. Visions exploded behind his eyes. Mountains of skulls stretching into eternity, rivers of blood flowing backward, and at the horizon, a figure of brass sitting on a throne of bone. Not looking down, but straight ahead, as if meeting Khorne's gaze through the veil between worlds. In that instant, Khorne understood. Every skull he had claimed, every drop of blood he had spilled had been a note, a sound in the infinite song that kept Khorne awake, and Khorne was listening. When he awoke, hours or days later, he was not the same. His voice, once human, now carried an echo, a metallic undertone, like two beings speaking in harmony. His eyes glowed permanently with faint red light. His armor could no longer be cleaned. The blood refused to fade. The other warriors called it a blessing, but Khorne knew it was something far greater, and far worse. He had not been given power. He had been tuned. From that day onward, wherever he went, the song went with him. In the heartbeats of dying soldiers, in the grinding of tank treads, in the flicker of plasma fire, the universe had become one vast drum, and he was its rhythm. That is the choir of skulls. Not voices, not demons, not sound. It is the pattern of death itself. And once you hear it, you never stop hearing it. When Khorne looked to the sky that night, he no longer saw stars. He saw eyes, watching, waiting, counting, and in the deepest corner of his soul, something smiled. Because the choir had accepted him, he was no longer a soldier, no longer a man. He was a note in the endless hymn of slaughter. There comes a moment when faith stops being belief and becomes biology. When your devotion is not something you feel, but something you are. For Khorne Hale, that moment came when the blood in his veins began to change color. The transformation was not a single event, not a blinding revelation or sudden metamorphosis. It was a slow, relentless rewriting, cell by cell, bone by bone. It began in whispers, in sensations he couldn't explain. His blood no longer cooled when exposed to air. It hissed. His wounds closed faster than they should. His heartbeat no longer echoed like flesh, but like the distant pound of a war drum. He told himself it was adrenaline, mutation, perhaps the warp. But deep down, he knew. This was not corruption. It was evolution, the World Eaters noticed. They didn't question it. In their war bands, divinity wasn't a matter of holiness. It was measured in slaughter. A warrior who refused to die was proof of faith, not witchcraft. They began to follow Khorne more closely, not as comrades but as pilgrims. When he walked into battle, they walked behind him. When he lifted his weapon, they lifted theirs. He had become a symbol of something even the maddest among them barely understood. The point where mortal will becomes divine inevitability. The turning point came on the planet Nerath Prime, a world that had once been a shrine to the Emperor. Marble statues lined its cities, their faces serene and untouched by time. The air still smelled faintly of incense, even as war turned the streets to ash. Khorne's warband descended like vultures. The Imperium had fortified the last remaining basilica, a cathedral so massive that it blotted out the sun with its spires. Thousands of defenders lined its walls, sisters of battle, guardsmen, zealots, priests. Their hymns echoed through the ruins, stubborn and pure. When Khorne approached, he heard something beneath their chanting. The faint hum of the choir, distant, patient, hungry. He raised his axe. "Let them sing," he said quietly. "Their god has waited long enough to hear his own echo." The siege lasted 3 days. The defenders fought like angels with broken wings, fearless, beautiful, desperate. The air shimmered with lasfire and promethium, and the stone of the basilica bled molten glass. But every time one of Khorne's warriors fell, he felt their death reverberate through him, like a pulse being absorbed into a larger rhythm. By the dawn of the 4th day, the basilica's gates fell. The sisters charged, chanting litanies through tears. Their armor was painted gold and white, their faith incandescent. They fired until their weapons melted. When the last one fell, she did so clutching her rosarius, whispering, "The Emperor protects." Khorne knelt beside her as she died. "I used to believe that too," he said softly. Then, almost tenderly, he took her skull. When he stepped into the basilica, the choir screamed, the walls shook. The stained glass windows exploded inward, showering the floor in color and fire. The blood pooling at his feet began to move, slow at first, then faster, spiraling around him in patterns that defied gravity. The others fell to their knees, unable to breathe beneath the pressure. Khorne stood alone in the center of the storm, his armor glowing faintly from within. The mark on his chest, once a mere scar, was now a wound of light. Blood streamed upward from the corpses around him, drawn toward it. He felt it enter him, not like liquid but like memory. Every kill, every scream, every act of hate from 1,000 dying throats burned through him like scripture. His vision blurred. The world turned red, then the voice came. It wasn't human. It wasn't sound. It was impact, each word hitting like a hammer strike in his skull. "You are not mine yet." The air trembled. Khorne gasped, dropping to one knee. His heart was pounding so hard that it cracked his ribs. He looked up at the pulsing wound of light in his chest, and he realized something horrifying. The voice wasn't speaking to him. It was inside him. The blood had become sentient. The choir, that infinite song of death, wasn't outside anymore. It was singing through him. The mark on his body split open, not bleeding, but shining, light so bright it burned through the smoke and dust. His bones glowed through his flesh. His armor screamed as if alive, the metal warping and reshaping itself, fusing to him. He rose again, taller, heavier, but utterly silent. When the World Eaters saw him, they didn't cheer. They simply dropped to their knees. Khorne looked down at his hands. They no longer trembled. They no longer bled. The skin was red now, not from paint or blood, but from within. Translucent, glowing faintly like magma beneath glass. His eyes had lost all white, replaced by a uniform crimson glow. He no longer felt exhaustion, or fear, or even anger. What replaced it was clarity, a perfect, terrible stillness. For the first time in his existence, Khorne Hale understood Khorne's nature. The blood god was not chaos. He was balance, a universe's method of remembering every act of violence it had ever committed. Every scream, every wound, every drop of blood was a data point in an infinite equation. And now, Khorne was part of that equation. He wasn't just serving Khorne anymore. He was helping him count. When he spoke, his voice carried the echo of thousands. "I see now," he whispered. "The blood never falls. It only rises." His warband followed him through the basilica, silent. They didn't speak, didn't ask questions. Those who touched his armor found it warm, almost too warm, as though the heat of a dying sun pulsed beneath the surface. He stood before the altar of the Emperor, its golden statue cracked and bleeding from the bombardment. For a long moment, Khorne said nothing. Then he raised his axe and struck once. The statue shattered. What poured from its wound was not molten gold, but blood. Not metaphor, not vision. Real thick living blood. It flooded the altar, filling the basilica until it reached his knees. The World Eaters screamed in joy, tearing off their helmets, bathing in it, laughing like madmen. But Khorne didn't move. He stood still, watching as the blood rose. When it reached his chest, it stopped. Then the voice spoke again, softer now, almost tender. "You are closer." He closed his eyes. "Then take me," but there was no answer. Only the sound of the choir, louder now, deafening. The skulls of the dead trembled. The blood began to churn and climb up the walls, forming patterns, symbols, faces. And in every one of those faces, Khorne saw himself. Thousands of reflections, each smiling, each identical. The blood wasn't claiming him. It was copying him. When it was over, the basilica was silent. The blood had cooled into glass. The warband was gone, vanished, their skulls fused into the new altar. And Khorne stood alone, the mark on his chest now glowing steady and calm. He looked to the heavens, to the void where stars once burned, and for the first time, he felt the weight of infinity press down on him. He wasn't mortal anymore, but neither was he God. He was something in between. A bridge of blood between the real and the unreal. A living wound in the universe that never healed. And somewhere beyond the veil of existence, on the throne of endless skulls, Khorne stirred. Not in joy, not in rage, but in recognition. A warrior had become more than a servant. He had become a reflection. And in that reflection, Khorne saw something he had not seen in eons. Ambition. And once you hear it, you never stop hearing it. When Khorne looked to the sky that night, he no longer saw stars. He saw eyes. Watching, waiting, counting, and in the deepest corner of his soul, something smiled. Because the choir had accepted him. He was no longer a soldier. No longer a man. He was a note in the endless hymn of slaughter. The war never ends. That's the first truth they teach you in the Imperium. Whispered by commissars, preached by priests, carved into the walls of every fortress world. But Khorne Hale had learned something the Imperium never understood. War changes. It mutates. It grows its own anatomy, blood, bone, and brass. And those who walk too far down its spine don't come back as men. The path of brass wasn't a place. It was a transformation. It began after the fall of Nereth Prime, when the galaxy itself seemed to take notice of him. His name, if you could still call it that, spread through the lower warp like a pulse. Cults whispered it in their rituals. Chaos warbands chanted it before their raids. Even the Adeptus Mechanicus recorded his movements in forbidden data codices, calling him Subject Hale Anomaly 9. But the World Eaters didn't speak his name anymore. They called him something older. The Ascendant. Khorne didn't speak often. When he did, the air changed temperature. His voice carried weight, like the echo of artillery beneath the surface of language. He no longer commanded through fear or loyalty. He radiated command. The weak knelt without understanding why. It was on the blasted world of Dravencourt, a planet so soaked in violence that the very soil was metallic, that Khorne began to see what he was becoming. The sky above was a dull crimson, constantly raining ash and iron flakes. The ground pulsed faintly, as if the world itself was alive. Or dying. Perhaps both. He walked through the ruins of an old manufactorum. Its spires collapsed into jagged ridges of melted steel. The walls still bore the aquila, half erased by corrosion and blood. His footsteps left molten impressions in the floor, though he felt no heat. Around him, the World Eaters butchered what was left of the local militia. It wasn't war anymore. It was ritual. Every scream, Every gunshot, every heartbeat, folded into the choir that now followed Khorne like a second shadow. He felt it even when there was no sound. That hum. That impossible resonance beneath reality. It was the same rhythm that had carried him through every battlefield, every kill. Only now, it was louder, denser. As if it were drawing nearer to something. Something final. In the distance, the horizon shimmered. He thought it was heat distortion at first, but the mirage didn't fade. It pulsed. Brass towers, half visible through smoke, spiraled up from the earth and back down again, as if breathing. The path of brass had appeared. He didn't remember walking toward it. One moment he stood in the ruins. The next he was standing before those impossible towers. They weren't built. They had grown, each surface rippling like living metal, engraved with faces screaming in frozen ecstasy. The sky above turned darker as he approached, and lightning crawled across the clouds in spirals, illuminating the shape of something colossal, unseen but felt. The choir went silent, and then came the first step. The ground before him wasn't dirt or stone. It was skulls, millions of them, fused together by molten brass, forming a road that stretched beyond sight. Each one hummed faintly, like strings of an instrument being tuned by the wind. Khorne's foot sank slightly into the first skull. It was warm. He walked. Each step echoed differently. The first sounded like thunder. The second, like a heartbeat. The third, like a scream swallowed too fast to finish. He realized the skulls weren't silent. They were alive. With every step, he heard them whisper. "We walked this road too." The voices came from below, from deep beneath the brass. Some wept, some laughed, some begged him to stop. He didn't. At the 5th mile, he began to see reflections. The brass wasn't solid anymore. It rippled like liquid, showing scenes that weren't there. He saw himself, a younger version, bleeding in the sands of Tarsus 5. He saw the faces of those he'd killed, staring back at him, expressionless. He saw the girl in the basilica whose skull he'd taken. Her lips moved, forming words he couldn't hear. At the 10th mile, the air grew thick. It wasn't just heat. It was pressure. Every breath tasted of iron. His armor began to fuse tighter against his skin. The brass beneath his boots pulsed in time with his heartbeat, and he understood. This road wasn't built for travel. It was built for transformation. He was walking across the anatomy of Khorne himself. The towers ahead grew taller with each step. Their tops vanished into the clouds, and rivers of molten blood poured down their sides, carving runes that shifted when he blinked. Shapes moved inside them. Titans made of flesh and metal, faceless and endless, kneeling as he passed. When he reached the midpoint, the choir returned. It didn't sing anymore. It roared. The skulls beneath him vibrated violently, the brass melting and reforming into new shapes. The whispers became screams, but not in pain, in praise. The faces in the molten towers turned toward him, mouths opening in unison. He stopped walking. In the distance, the horizon tore open. It wasn't light or shadow. It was both. A wound in reality shaped like a throne. For a moment, Khorne felt something close to fear. Not because he was unworthy, but because he understood he was being measured. The path had no end. The brass road wasn't leading to the throne. It was part of it. Every step he'd taken, every kill, every act of rage, it was all leading here, because he was walking on the physical manifestation of his own violence. Every life he had taken was one of these skulls. He looked down and saw faces he remembered. The commissar from Vrax, the priest from Thessalon, the sergeant from his 1st regiment, the girl from the basilica, even the reflection that had once smiled at him in the glass. Each one looked up, waiting. Khorne realized then what Khorne's true test was. It wasn't endless slaughter. It wasn't devotion. It was recognition. Could a man look upon his own sins, not with regret, but understanding? He fell to his knees. The brass burned his skin, but he didn't move. The choir crescendoed into madness, the sky pulsing like a beating heart. And then, without warning, silence. The storm above stopped. The towers froze. The skulls went still. From the horizon, a shadow began to move. Not walking, not flying, simply becoming. It was vast beyond comprehension, a form that had no beginning or end. Its edges flickered between matter and memory. A voice filled the world, not spoken, but carved directly into existence. "You have walked far, Blood Ascendant." Khorne didn't speak. He couldn't. Every nerve in his body was vibrating with divine pressure. "Do you know why you were spared?" He forced himself to raise his head. "Because I never stopped," the voice rumbled. half laughter, half earthquake. No, because you remembered. Every drop, every name, every death. You kept the count. You kept the faith. Khorne's vision blurred. The mark on his chest burned through his armor, glowing like a sun. Do you seek the throne? He hesitated. And that was his final act of humanity. I seek the fight, he whispered. The laughter shook the world. Then rise, for you are the fight. The brass beneath him melted into light. The towers dissolved. The sky collapsed inward, folding around him like a wound closing. His flesh peeled away, replaced by metal that flowed like blood. His veins turned to rivers of molten brass. His bones became iron. His eyes, twin suns of red fire. When the transformation ended, there was no body left. Only form, only purpose. Khorne Hale had ceased to exist. In his place stood the Pathwalker, a being of pure motion and endless war, not mortal, not God, but a perpetual storm given shape. The choir sang once more, one final note that rippled across the stars, and on 1,000 worlds, warriors looked up from their battles and shivered without knowing why, because somewhere, far beyond their sight, a new sound had joined the eternal song of Khorne, and it sounded like a heartbeat made of metal. They say the galaxy forgets its dead, that after a war ends, even the names of its heroes are eaten by time, their victories reduced to numbers, their graves paved over by newer battles. But there are some wars that remember. Khorne Hale became one of them. By the time the Imperium's scribes pieced together what had happened on Dravencourt, he was already gone, vanished into the warp storms like a spark into a furnace. But the aftershocks remained. Armies disappeared without explanation. Entire planets fell silent. Their surfaces melted into brass plains, stretching to the horizon. Vox records spoke of chanting, not from orbit, not from the living, but from the worlds themselves. They called it the Resonance Plague. No demonic incursion. No known weapon, just sound. The low hum of countless voices whispering the same name over and over, until the cities that heard it collapsed in on themselves. Khorne Hale. But those who fought in those wars, those who stood on the ground when it happened, they spoke differently. They said it wasn't a plague, it was a reminder. The first recorded sighting came from Erethus Reach, a fortress world on the edge of Segmentum Obscurus. It was a place that had known war for millennia. Its skies black with smoke, its oceans long since boiled away. When the Blood Crusades came, the defenders prepared as they always had. They had seen Khorneti warbands before. They knew how they fought, brutal, predictable, loud. But this time, the enemy was silent. When the orbital pict feeds captured the first wave, it wasn't an army that descended. It was a storm, a literal red storm, spiraling down from the atmosphere like a bleeding vortex, thunder made of screams, lightning shaped like spears, and through it marched figures of brass. Thousands of them, moving in perfect formation. At their center walked a giant. No markings, no banners, no chain axe roars, only a steady sound, rhythmic, mechanical, like the pulse of the galaxy itself. Every step he took cracked the ground. Every impact sent shockwaves of sound that rippled through the battlefield. Imperial artillery ceased to function. Vox channels went silent. Even the commissars, those engines of faith, could no longer speak. And then, the soldiers began to remember things that weren't their own. Visions, flashes of other wars, other lifetimes. They saw themselves as different men, on different worlds, dying the same deaths in the same rhythm. Some fell to their knees, clutching their helmets, screaming prayers to gods they didn't believe in. Others simply dropped their weapons, their memories eaten by the hum. That was the first lesson of Khorne's ascendance. He was no longer fighting against anyone. He was fighting through them. The choir of skulls had found its instrument. When he raised his hand, it wasn't to strike. It was to resonate. The battlefield itself became a speaker. The iron in the soil, the metal in their armor, the liquid in their blood, all vibrated in unison. Tanks imploded. Titans froze mid-step, their pilots reduced to pulp inside. The entire southern hemisphere of Erethus Reach cracked open, revealing veins of molten brass beneath. And yet, through it all, Khorne said nothing. He didn't roar like the berserkers. He didn't pray like the cultists. He just listened. Every scream, every gunshot, every heartbeat, each one folded neatly into his rhythm. He was no longer man or demon. He was memory-given motion. The Magos biologists who studied the aftermath would later note that the corpses left behind showed no signs of decay. Their tissue had transformed into thin, metallic fibers, as if the flesh itself had tried to imitate the sound that killed it. The wars that followed were not fought. They were replayed. Wherever Khorne passed, the past returned. On Thessalon 9, soldiers swore they saw the same battle fought centuries earlier, repeating in perfect detail. The dead rose, not as demons, but as echoes, phantoms made of noise, reenacting their final moments over and over. A guardsman firing at a foe who wasn't there. A sister dying on her knees, clutching a weapon that had turned to dust. The planet became a theater of repetition, looping endlessly until the surface fractured from the strain. The Inquisition tried to purge it, sending exorcists and psychic kill teams. None came back. One final Vox recording survived, distorted by static. A voice, trembling. "It's not the warp. It's us. We're remembering ourselves to death." After that, Khorne Hale ceased being a person in Imperial records. He became a phenomenon. There were reports of a brass silhouette appearing in the reflection of blood, visible even light years away from the nearest battlefield. Pilgrims claimed to hear his footsteps echoing through cathedrals, synchronized with their own heartbeats. Tech priests swore their machines whispered his name in Binharik between data streams. And yet, for every world that was consumed, others celebrated. The cults of Khorne spread faster than ever before. To them, Khorne wasn't a ghost. He was proof that divinity was attainable through devotion, that one could ascend not by begging for favor, but by earning it with blood. They built monuments in his likeness, not statues, but vast resonant towers that sang when the wind blew, built from the skulls of those sacrificed in his name. The towers played his rhythm endlessly, day and night, vibrating through the air, through the ground, through the dreams of every mortal nearby. Some of those dreams became real. On Velkar's moon, miners digging through an iron canyon uncovered a figure buried beneath the rock. Not a corpse, a shell, hollow, human-shaped, carved from brass, pulsing faintly as if breathing. When they touched it, their flesh fused into the metal. The choir sang for 7 days. The moon cracked on the 8th. The Mechanicus called it resonant contagion. The ecclesiarchy called it the demon of reflected war. But the cults called it what it was, a gift. And somewhere in the warp, Khorne watched in silence, for even among the gods, Khorne's existence was a disturbance. He had not broken the order of Khorne's domain. He had embodied it too perfectly. The blood god did not create Khorne's ascendance. He merely allowed it, because Khorne does not bless out of mercy. He blesses to see what will happen when the strong stand alone. And Khorne Hale had stood. When he walked the path of brass, he had become part of Khorne's machinery, an engine of war that ran not on chaos, but on memory. Every battle he fought afterward was no longer for victory, but for continuity. The universe would remember what violence sounded like. On the outer rim of Segmentum Tempestus, an Imperial fleet once recorded a strange occurrence, a wave of sound crossing light years in perfect harmonic intervals. The frequency was low, almost inaudible. But when translated into binary, it read like scripture. All wars are one war. All blood is one blood. For 3 days, every Imperial ship's systems synced to that rhythm. Vox channels repeated it endlessly, even after disconnection. Then silence. The fleet was never found again. Those who survived the later centuries claimed that sometimes, when standing on battlefields long after the shooting stopped, they could still feel a faint vibration underfoot, not loud enough to hear, just enough to unsettle. The sensation of something vast, still turning beneath the surface of reality. The scholars of the Adeptus Terra have a name for it now. They call it the brass pulse. But the cults have another word. They say it's the heartbeat of Khorne Hale, echoing through eternity, keeping count so that Khorne never has to. Because even gods forget. But war never does. And somewhere, between the stars, between the echoes of dying worlds, a single voice hums softly through the dark. A rhythm that once belonged to a man, now belonging to history itself. Dum-dum, dum-dum. The song of endless war continues. There is a lie buried deep in every prayer, a quiet hope whispered by mortals who don't understand what they're asking for. They pray for eternity. They pray for immortality. They imagine it as victory, as a crown, as light, as rest earned at the end of struggle. But in truth, eternity is not peace. It is pressure. And for Khorne Hale, immortality was not a gift. It was gravity. He no longer slept. The concept of exhaustion had become meaningless. The flow of time itself warped around him, folding into recursive loops that replayed every battle he had ever fought. To the Imperium he had vanished. To the servants of Khorne he had ascended. But in the reality between those truths Khorne endured. For what is a god, if not a prisoner of their own worship? The galaxy burned as it always did. Hive worlds collapsed under famine and war. Orcs gathered in green tides. Tyranids devoured systems whole. But no matter where the wars raged, there was always something else. Something invisible. Watching. It was said that if you listened closely, in the moments just before death on a battlefield, you could hear it, the faint rhythm beneath the chaos. A heartbeat that did not belong to any living thing. Khorne's presence was no longer physical. He existed as resonance. A harmonic echo that passed through matter, consciousness, and even the warp itself. When the World Eaters roared his name in blood-soaked arenas, the sound waves carried him. When the artillery of the Astra Militarum flattened continents, the concussions fed him. When an Eldar blade whispered through armor, the hiss carried his voice for a fraction of a second. He was everywhere war existed. But the universe is cruel to those who cannot die. At first, the immortality was intoxicating, a storm of endless awareness. He could see every battle as it unfolded, across galaxies, across time. Each explosion was a pulse of light, each death a spark of heat. He could feel the slow rotation of dying suns, the agony of broken planets, the electric pulse of a plasma coil moments before it melted a man's spine. But then came the silence. Not absence. Stillness. The void between moments of violence. For Khorne's domain is built on motion, on rhythm, on noise, but even the blood god's song pauses between beats. And in those pauses, Khorne was alone. It was in one of these pauses, a stretch of time that might have lasted seconds or centuries, that he began to think again. The path of brass had not prepared him for this. It had taught him strength, endurance, clarity, but not patience. He could feel his mind stretching across worlds, searching for meaning in a universe that only offered violence. He began to realize something horrifying. Without war, he did not exist. The choir, once his companions, his constant background hum, grew faint. The voices that had once sung his name now echoed back as ghosts, hollow and fading. Planets he had once reshaped into brass wastelands cooled and turned to dust. The faces of those he had known, enemies and followers alike, vanished into history's static. Khorne began to lose shape, not physically, that was long gone, but conceptually. His identity dissolved. His name was still whispered, but he no longer recognized it. Every time someone invoked the Blood Ascendant, he felt it like a memory of someone else's life. He drifted through the warp like smoke. He saw civilizations rise and fall, empires repeat the same mistakes, mortals rebuild altars to gods who had already forgotten them. He saw Terra still burning with faith, still enslaved to the golden corpse they called Emperor. He laughed once. The sound broke 3 stars, but even laughter was hollow now. Eternity had become weight, a crushing, formless pressure that demanded purpose. And Khorne, in his infinite silence, offered none. The blood god does not speak. He does not guide. He only watches. So Khorne watched too. He watched as the World Eaters fractured into madness, their skulls filled with static, their wars losing rhythm. He watched as the cults that had built temples in his name began to forget the sound of his voice. He watched as those who once worshipped blood began to worship noise instead. Meaningless slaughter without discipline, without memory. It sickened him, because Khorne's faith had never been about chaos. It had been about order through destruction. Every kill was a note in a perfect song, the sound of the universe counting itself. But now the music was gone. What replaced it was cacophony. On one world he saw Khornide warbands tearing each other apart over the skulls of their own followers. On another, he saw mortals carving his mark into their skin without knowing what it meant. They screamed his name like a weapon, not like a prayer. In their madness, they had made him small. For a being of resonance, that was worse than death. He tried to silence them, tried to pull himself back from the chaos, to condense into something real again. He tried to remember the weight of a weapon, the heat of breath, the feel of blood on his hands. But the more he focused, the more fragmented he became. Each act of memory tore him in half. Part of him remembering, part of him watching the memory die. And in those fractured reflections, he saw something new. Another him. Not God, not legend, just a man, kneeling in a trench, mud up to his knees, hands shaking as he reloaded a last rifle, a soldier on some forgotten battlefield of the past muttering to himself. "I don't want to die," the man whispered. Khorne remembered saying those words once, long ago, before the choir, before the mark, before the throne. The memory hurt. He reached toward it, and for a moment, The universe flickered. The brass melted away. The choir went silent. He saw the stars again. Real stars, cold and bright. And then he realized what he was seeing wasn't the past. It was still happening. Somewhere, on some nameless world, a mortal man was dying exactly as Khorne once had. Alone, afraid, surrounded by endless war. He could hear his heartbeat. The rhythm was familiar. He wanted to reach out, to show the man what came next, to tell him that the fear never ends, it just changes shape. But when he tried to speak, no sound came. The man couldn't hear him, and that was when Khorne understood the true curse of immortality. It wasn't eternal life. It was irrelevance, to exist forever but never again touch the world you came from. To be remembered but never understood. To be worshipped by strangers who think they know your name but not your truth. Khorne's anger burned hotter than ever. The choir returned. Faintly at first, then louder, sensing his fury. Across the galaxy, weapons fired without command. Soldiers screamed without knowing why. Whole cities went mad for reasons no psyker could explain, and through it all, the heartbeat returned. Dum dum, dum dum, it echoed through every shell. Every scream, every dying whisper. And for the first time in millennia, Khorne felt alive. He realized that perhaps immortality wasn't a curse, not if it could still make him feel, not if he could still remember the pulse of life through death. Perhaps he couldn't end the war, but he could keep it honest. As long as mortals bled, he would count. As long as they screamed, he would listen. As long as they prayed, he would answer, not with mercy, but with memory, because that was the weight of immortality, to never rest, to never fade, to carry the universe's sins like a drumbeat that never stops. Somewhere far beyond the materium, the laughter of gods rolled like thunder, and below it, steady and calm, came the sound of a heartbeat. Dum-dum, dum-dum. The sound of a man who refused to stop counting. The sound of Khorne Hale. Still alive, still listening, still remembering. The warp is not a place. It is an emotion-given geography, an ocean made of thought and hunger and regret. For mortals, it is the sea they must cross to travel between stars. For the gods, it is home. For Khorne Hale, it became something else entirely. A mirror that refused to break. No mortal eye can truly see the warp. Even demons cannot describe it without falling into madness. It is endless, it is intimate, it is made of memory and malice. Every idea, every fear, every drop of emotion ever spilled into existence lives there, moving, reshaping, devouring itself. And somewhere in that infinite storm, Khorne Hale walked, not as a god, not as a man, but as an echo given weight. His presence hummed through the psychic tides like a frequency older than thought, a rhythm that even demons avoided. To them, he was not a rival. He was an anomaly, a silence that moved like a blade. The warp remembered him. Whenever a war in the materium burned too bright, whenever soldiers screamed their last prayers to Khorne before dying, the warp would shudder. A ripple of sound would spread across its crimson waves, and in those ripples, Khorne appeared. He did not arrive. He manifested. Imagine thunder forming a man. That was Khorne Hale. He appeared where the noise was loudest, where the warp storms fed on mortal agony, where demons feasted on faith and fear. But wherever he walked, the howling stopped. Not from mercy, but from awe. Even among creatures that were nothing but violence. His stillness was terrifying, because Khorne's war was not against others anymore. It was against the warp itself. He had begun to see what none of the gods ever could, that chaos was not eternal. It only believed it was. Like a storm, it depended on energy, on motion, on belief. Without mortals to feed it, the warp would starve. And Khorne, who was no longer man or god, had no belief left to give. He was not fueled by worship. He was not bound by oaths. He was what Khorne himself could never be, free of purpose. The warp noticed. The first to come for him was a keeper of secrets, an avatar of Slanesh with skin like polished glass and a voice that sounded like mercy. It slithered across the broken sky of that place, offering him indulgence, memory, sensation. "You are lost," it whispered. "You are the song that forgot its words." Khorne turned to it slowly. His reflection rippled across its surface like firelight. "No," he said quietly. "I am the silence that remembers the song." And with that, he reached out, not with hands, but with sound. The vibration that left him wasn't noise. It was pressure, a seismic pulse of remembrance that shattered the demon's form from within. Its body folded in on itself, collapsing into a single note of pain that was swallowed by the void. Then there was only quiet. The other gods took notice. They had always watched Khorne's realm warily. The great brass citadels, the rivers of blood, the constant roar of rage. But now, something new was moving between their domains. A phantom of the blood god that did not serve him, did not speak his name, and yet carried his rhythm in its wake. Tzeentch sent 1,000 eyes to observe him. They burned out one by one. Nurgle's plagues tried to infect him. They evaporated in the hum of his pulse. Even Slanish's whispers, so powerful they could seduce pain itself, fell silent when they reached him. The warp began to change. It had always been alive, an ocean of emotion. But now, under Khorne's shadow, it began to remember what it once was before the gods grew fat on mortal faith. Beneath the rage and lust and rot, there was something older, something purer, the echo of thought before corruption. Khorne had found it. He called it the still point. No mortal has ever seen it. No daemon can describe it. But it exists, a place within the warp where motion stops, where thought becomes matter, where even gods hesitate to look. It is said that this was the first silence, the breath between the Emperor's heartbeat and his first word. Khorne made it his war zone. There, the very laws of chaos folded and broke. Rivers of blood froze mid-flow. The screams of dying souls echoed backward in time. Even the light seemed uncertain whether to move or stay, and at the center stood Khorne Hale. He was not flesh. He was not metal. He was pressure, condensed into a shape that could not die. His armor shimmered between existence and memory, covered in runes that burned with words from a language too old to speak. His eyes, twin furnaces of molten rhythm, looked outward at the storm of gods circling beyond. They feared him, because he had become what none of them could, stillness that kills. When the demons of Khorne came to test him, great brass juggernauts snorting flame and fury, they charged into the still point and disintegrated. Not burned, not torn apart, they simply unraveled, like memories forgotten. When the bloodletters screamed their praise to Khorne, Khorne did not answer. He did not kneel. He did not bow. He only whispered, "You are noise without meaning." And they vanished. For the first time in eons, the warp knew quiet. But quiet is dangerous. Quiet makes the gods remember their hunger. Khorne stirred. Across his domain, the rivers of blood slowed. The skulls upon his throne cracked in unison. For the first time since time began, the blood god's fortress trembled. Not from fear, but from recognition. He had not created Khorne Hale, but he understood him. Khorne was the final perfection of Khorne's creed. The warrior who fought without need, who killed without question, who existed only for the act itself. But that perfection was also rebellion, for if war can become pure, it no longer needs a god, and Khorne, who has no voice, spoke through silence. The still point bled light across the warp. Armies of demons clashed in patterns that mortals would have called impossible. Skies folded in half. Mountains screamed. Planets of thought shattered like glass. The silent war had begun. It was not a battle in the sense mortals understand. There were no sides, no tactics, no victory. It was an argument between two infinities. Between motion and stillness. Between rage and remembrance. Each time Khorne's will surged, Khorne absorbed it, shaping it into pattern. Each time Khorne's calm spread, Khorne shattered it with pure unreason. The warp itself became the battlefield, reshaping under their conflict. Worlds of brass sank beneath waves of blood. Towers of bone grew like forests, and then were crushed by silence. Every beat of their struggle sent ripples into the materium. Planets screamed. Psychers burst into flames. Navigators saw impossible geometries twisting through the warp storms. Some claimed to hear a chant in their dreams, a voice that was not quite Khorne's but close. All wars end in silence. It lasted forever, or a moment. In the warp, there's no difference. When it ended, nothing did. There was no victor, no corpse, no throne toppled. The warp simply shifted. The gods resumed their endless games. The storms continued to howl. The demons forgot. But deep beneath the surface, at the still point where silence was born, something faint remained, a heartbeat, dum-dum, dum-dum, and a whisper that no god could silence. I will not fade. There are no clocks in the warp, no measure of hours, no count of years. But if eternity could draw a breath, this is what it would sound like. Silence. Then a heartbeat. Dum-dum, dum-dum. For uncounted ages, it echoed beneath the rotting skies of the immaterium, steady, patient, defiant. The gods raged, empires fell, galaxies burned and were reborn. but the sound endured. It was faint, but it was constant, a rhythm older than despair. A name that refused to die, Khorne. They say no one truly defeats Khorne. Not gods, not mortals, not even time. And yet there were whispers, faint rumors that somewhere deep within the warp's red heart, the blood god's throne was quieter than before, not silent, just waiting. The silent war had changed everything. For all its fury, all its violence, it had revealed something the chaos gods had long forgotten. That eternity without contrast is decay. Rage without resistance loses meaning. Even a god needs an opposite. And that was what Khorne had become. Not a rival, not a challenger, a balance. His still point still pulsed in the far reaches of the warp, far beyond mortal perception. It was neither light nor dark, a place where even demons hesitated to breathe. From it, the echo spread outward, threading through the arteries of unreality, touching every shadow of war in existence. Whenever a weapon was raised, the echo answered. Whenever a soldier screamed, it counted. Whenever blood was spilled, it remembered. Khorne was not gone. He had become the memory of violence itself. Yet even in that eternal state, even as a rhythm imprinted on the fabric of creation, something in him still hungered. He did not crave battle. He no longer needed faith. What he longed for now was understanding, to know why. Why mortals never stopped fighting. Why the gods demanded worship through pain. Why existence itself was addicted to suffering. He had seen it all, from the trenches of forgotten worlds to the star forges of demon realms, and it was always the same. Life defined by conflict. The universe was a wound that refused to close. But for the first time, Khorne wondered if that was because the wound feared healing. The realization haunted him. He began to move again, not as form or flame, but as intent. Across the warp he drifted, through oceans of thought and storms of despair. He saw the reflection of every battle that ever was. The siege of Terra, the fall of Cadia, the wars yet to come. All repeating, all familiar, all identical. It was not destiny. It was addiction. He reached the border between the immaterium and reality, a place where stars bled into thought, where the Emperor's psychic beacon still pulsed like a dying sun. There he stopped. For the first time in eons he looked back. Behind him, the warp churned. A billion screams turned to thunder. Before him lay the materium, cold, indifferent, beautiful. He could cross it. He could return, but to what? To flesh? To suffering? To a humanity that would never remember him for what he truly was? He hesitated. The silence stretched. And then faintly he heard it. A voice, not divine, not demonic. Human. It was the voice of a dying guardsman on some forgotten world, whispering to the stars as lasfire lit the night. "I don't want to die," the man said, trembling. "Please, not like this." Khorne remembered that voice. It was his own, centuries ago in another body, before the mark, before the curse. The words broke something inside him. He reached out. And for an instant, the veil between worlds trembled. On that battlefield, the dying guardsman gasped as the air around him shimmered. The gunfire slowed. The world faded to crimson. And there, standing over him, was a figure made of shadow and brass. Khorne. The soldier tried to speak, but his throat filled with blood. Khorne knelt beside him, not as a god, not as an echo, but as something closer to human than he had been in 1,000 years. He didn't offer salvation. He didn't promise peace. He just listened. The soldier's heartbeat faltered, then stopped. Khorne waited, as if expecting his own to follow. It didn't. He realized then that the universe was not cruel because it killed. It was cruel because it remembered. Every act of kindness, every scream, every betrayal, all of it left marks, and those marks never faded. They built upon each other, layer after layer, until even gods forgot where the first wound began. Khorne understood what Khorne never could. The blood god thrived on the act of killing. But Khorne had discovered something older than that. The memory of violence, the sorrow that followed the rage, the heartbeat after the blade falls. That was what the gods feared, because remembrance breeds guilt, and guilt makes monsters human. He looked down at the dead guardsmen. Around them, the battlefield had gone quiet. The air shimmered, heavy with the scent of smoke and ash. And then, for the first time in 10,000 years, Khorne whispered, "Rest." The sound was soft, too soft for any mortal ear, but the warp heard it. For a moment that defied reason, an entire sector fell silent. Warp storms flickered. Demons froze mid-slaughter. Even the great brass citadel of Khorne paused, as if listening to something it did not understand. The silence grew. It spread. Not destruction. Release. On dozens of worlds, soldiers dropped their weapons, overcome with a sudden stillness they couldn't explain. Some cried, some prayed, some simply stood, feeling for the first time what it meant to be done. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. The wars resumed. The screams returned. The rhythm started again. Dum-dum, dum-dum. But something had changed. Deep within the warp, beneath the rivers of blood and mountains of skulls, the still point pulsed one final time. A single note, a perfect final sound, and then silence, no explosion. No scream, just absence. Khorne's throne trembled. For the first time since the dawn of time, the blood god lifted his head. His gaze fell upon the still point, and though he did not speak, every demon in existence felt his reaction, not anger, acknowledgement, the faintest spark of respect between predator and creation. For Khorne Hale had not defied Khorne. He had completed him. The cycle of war had found its echo, a rhythm that even gods could not silence. And though Khorne was gone, his legacy remained. Every time a warrior's hands trembled after battle, every time a soldier looked at their weapon and felt shame, every time blood was spilled and someone whispered, "Enough," that was him. The final lesson of the blood ascendant, that the greatest act of war is to remember it. Somewhere in the cold dark of the galaxy, a heartbeat still echoes, dum-dum, dum-dum, the last beat of war, the last echo of Khorne Hale, not forgotten, not gone, just silent, forever.